The human endocrine system is a system that works very closely with the nervous system. So often the nervous system will pick up a stimulus that a hormone, part of the endocrine system, will bring a response to. So the endocrine response is a much slower response because hormones need to be secreted and they need to travel places and then bring about a response, whereas a nervous response is a much quicker response. So you can look in your textbook for the summary of the nervous and the endocrine response. But before we get into the endocrine system, we need to look at the two different types of glands we have in our body. This section focuses only on the endocrine glands. So endocrine glands secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. So there are no ducts. The blood is traveling through the gland and the secretion, the hormone, is put into the bloodstream directly. So the way I remember that is I say, well, endo goes into the bloodstream. So there's a DO in endo and there's an OD in blood. Maybe a bit of a stretch, but yeah, it helps me. Then the other type of gland that we have in our body is looking at the exocrine glands. So exocrine glands secrete their substances. It's not a hormone. So it's not a protein-based substance. So that substance might be sweat or tears or saliva, for example, or even pancreatic juice. And those secretions are secreted via ducts. So a duct is a small tube that carries the substance, sweat, saliva, tears, from the gland to where it's going to be used. So exocrine secretions are used very close to where they are produced. So if you think of your salivary glands, they are just inside your mouth, and the saliva is used in your mouth. It doesn't travel far. Whereas endocrine secretions, hormones, work all over your body. So we're going to look at growth hormone, for example, which is used all over every single long bone and muscle all over your body. You can't have 5 million ducts secreting the hormone. It needs to be controlled by a single gland that puts the hormone directly into the bloodstream. So the hormone travels to where it needs to work. Let's look at our endocrine system. So this is our human endocrine system. We have the glands in the brain, the gland around the trachea, pancreas, adrenal glands, and then women obviously have ovaries. Whereas if this was a man, there wouldn't be ovaries, there would rather be testes. So we will zoom in there and look at the difference between the two. So let's get started at the top where we'll look at the hypothalamus. So looking at the hypothalamus is always just above the pituitary gland, which hangs outside the brain, if you remember from the nervous system section. So the pituitary gland is the pea-sized, pea-shaped little gland that hangs below the brain, and the hypothalamus is always just above it, because above there is the thalamus. So hypothalamus means low thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus, if we just point to that blue area there, that is the hypothalamus in the blue area. And the hypothalamus's job is to produce the hormone antidiuretic hormone. So if you think about if something is a diuretic, so that term diuretic, an example of a substance that is diuretic would be coffee. It makes you urinate more. So antidiuretic hormone, antidiuretic, will make you urinate less. So this controls osmoregulation. So the hypothalamus is stimulated by changes in the amount of water in your blood. Osmo meaning water, like osmosis. And the way it acts is it makes the tubules and the nephron, so in the kidney, more permeable to water in order to conserve water. So that means that more water will leave the tubule and be reabsorbed by the bloodstream when water levels are low. And there's a video that I've done on homeostasis of water levels that you can follow up on. Now, it's important to note here that I write produces antidiuretic hormone. Because when I do my video on the homeostasis of water levels, we talk about the pituitary gland secreting more or less antidiuretic hormone. So the hypothalamus produces antidiuretic hormone and secretes it into the pituitary where it's stored. So when your water levels are high or low, the hypothalamus is stimulated, but it will tell the pituitary gland to increase or decrease its secretion of ADH. But ADH is produced by the hypothalamus. The next gland in the brain that we study, there are others, we just don't study them, is this pea-sized gland over here, which is called the pituitary gland. So your pituitary gland is also called the master gland. It can also be called the hypophysis or hypophysis, but I always choose to use the word pituitary gland. It is considered to be a master gland because it secretes hormones that control other glands. So it's like the boss of all the glands. So your pituitary gland or your hypophysis secretes the following hormones. You've got growth hormone, which stimulates skeletal muscle and bone growth. So as a young person, your bones are growing, your muscles are growing. And then the next hormone it secretes is thyroid stimulating hormone, which is TSH. And now that will stimulate this gland just down here. So it would travel in the blood and stimulate the thyroid. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, we know stimulates the development of ova and sperm cells. So ova in the ovaries, sperm cells in the testes, so for men and women. And we dealt with that in the reproductive system. Luteinizing hormone, also from the reproductive system, causes the process of ovulation, so the bursting of a Graafian follicle, the rupturing of the Graafian follicle to produce a mature ovum. And it converts that ruptured Graafian follicle into the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone works on the ovaries. And the last hormone we look at is prolactin, which stimulates milk production in women when they are pregnant or about to give birth. So just some factors to consider about growth hormone. And some of the hormones we do an over-secretion and an under-secretion. The growth hormone has an over-secretion effect in adults and children that'll be quite different. So if you have too much growth hormone as a child, you end up with a condition called gigantism, which means your long bones and your muscles are physically bigger than the average person. So you are much taller, much bigger than the average person, because while you are growing, it over-produces growth hormone, which then means you're overstimulated to grow. Whereas in adults, we're done growing as adults, we're finished. So instead, if we have an over-secretion of growth hormone, we end up with a condition called acromegaly, which essentially means our jaw bones can grow a lot bigger than the average adult, and the bones of our hands can also become very, very bulky. Under-secretion of growth hormone in children can lead to a form of dwarfism. There are other causes of dwarfism, but in adults, an under-secretion has no effect because we're done growing. This diagram is just showing you the pituitary gland's blood supply coming from, there's the hypothalamus. So there are nerves that are leaving the hypothalamus that will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete more or less antidiuretic hormone. Because remember, the hypothalamus produces antidiuretic hormone, but it's stored just down here in the pituitary. The next gland, which is found at the top of the trachea, your windpipe, is the thyroid gland. So just a reminder, the thyroid gland is stimulated by thyroid-stimulating hormone from the pituitary, and the thyroid gland secretes a hormone called thyroxin, which controls your metabolic rate. So an example would be how fast cellular respiration happens in your body. So very importantly, we look at an over-secretion and an under-secretion of thyroxin. So if you have hypothyroidism, your thyroid gland might become a bit reduced in size, and that means you're not secreting enough thyroxin. So you could have a very low or slow metabolic rate. In children, it leads to stunted growth and slow mental development, which is called cretinism. In adults, a low metabolic rate leads to the person being slow to think, slow to process sentences, and also possibly they'll be slow to move, which can often lead to weight gain as a result of their low metabolic rate from a lack of thyroxin. And that's called myxedema in adults. Hyperthyroidism, hyper means a lot, hypo means low or a little. So hyperthyroidism is too much thyroxin being secreted, which in children or adults can lead to an increased metabolic rate, which means they're going to be very hyperactive. They might also be quite slender if they lose weight more easily because their metabolic rate is very fast. And they can develop a goiter, which is a swelling that occurs at the base of their neck. And it's a big swollen area or swelling behind the eyes. And that's what a goiter is. One of the very important principles of negative feedback is looking at the role of thyroid-stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland having a negative feedback loop with the thyroid gland and thyroxin, and how that controls your metabolic rate. So look out for that in another video. The next gland is one you did in grade 11 called the pancreas. That just sits just under your stomach. And the pancreas, obviously, remember, is an exocrine and an endocrine gland. It secretes hormones, so it's an endocrine gland, into the bloodstream. And those two hormones are insulin and glucagon. Insulin and glucagon work oppositely or antagonistically to each other. Insulin lowers blood sugar levels or blood glucose levels by converting glucose in your blood into glycogen, which is your storage molecule for glucose. And then that gets stored in the liver or skeletal muscle cells. So that might be after you eat a sugar-rich meal or glucose-rich meal. Glucagon, on the other hand, don't get confused between glucagon and glycogen. very important. Glucagon converts the stored glycogen back into glucose, maybe while you're exercising or while you're fasting, so that your blood glucose levels can be increased if they have dropped below normal. Just one condition associated with your pancreas, diabetes mellitus. It is when people have a shortage of insulin. So they are unable to lower their blood sugar levels. So their blood sugar levels or blood glucose levels are higher than the average person, and they remain high for long after eating a sugary meal. So that has come up a lot in finals recently. So just keep an eye on that kind of question on diabetes to make sure you're understanding it. Your adrenal glands are also grade 11 work. They sit on the top of each of your kidneys. So there's one, there's the other. And they secrete two hormones. One called aldosterone, which controls your salt or sodium levels in the kidneys. So do you excrete more salt after a salty meal or less salt after not eating enough salt? That is also homeostasis, and there's a video on it on my YouTube channel. And another important hormone that it secretes is adrenaline, which prepares your bodies for emergencies where you need to think clearly and your muscles will need to function very effectively. So that would also be related to your sympathetic nervous system, which is all about increasing your body's response to an emergency. So if you think of what your body needs in an emergency, you need to essentially get more blood to your brain to think clearly and to your muscles to work properly. So that means that blood needs to contain more glucose and more oxygen. So how do we do that? We increase our rate and depth of breathing as a result of adrenaline. So that means we breathe in more oxygen. This was a question in finals last year. You've got to answer it very clearly. You increase the rate of conversion of glycogen into glucose, just like glucagon works, but adrenaline can do the same thing. So you increase in the glucose amount in your blood. Then your heart rate will also increase because now you get that oxygen from your increased breathing and the glucose from your increased glycogen to glucose conversion. You travel it around your body much quicker as a result of your increased heart rate. The blood vessels to your skeletal muscles, heart and brain dilate, obviously to allow more blood to go to those areas because you don't want that glucose or that oxygen being directed elsewhere. So the blood vessels to your skin and digestive system constrict so that they're not wasting the glucose. It's important it only goes to the brain and the skeletal muscles. And very importantly, it's all good and well having all of the petrol in the world, but you need a fast car to drive it. So you need to have your thyroid gland being stimulated to increase the thyroxin secretion, which will increase your metabolic rate. So I'm saying is you can't give your cells all the oxygen and all the glucose in the world without actually telling your cells to work quicker. So that final point there, a lot of matrics forget to write in finals. So you need to learn the action of adrenaline. And another question came up, which I'll show you later, about how this leads to an increase in CO2, which needs to be then also brought back down to normal. Now, this is just revision. The ovaries, women have 2 ovaries. We have hormones that are secreted there, and the Graafian follicle in our ovaries secrete estrogen, and that is responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics, so such as puberty, the development of breasts, the onset of the menstrual period, etc. And estrogen also thickens the endometrium. But the corpus luteum in the ovary secretes progesterone, which further thickens the endometrium and makes sure the blastocyst will remain attached to that uterine wall that's been built up by the estrogen and thickened by the endometrium. It also inhibits the production of FSH from the pituitary gland. Now, if this person was a man, I don't want to remove the ovaries from the picture because then it's a complete outlook on the endocrine system. The man would have testes hanging outside of his body, and the testes have interstitial cells or cells of Leydig that produce testosterone, the male hormone. And the male hormone is responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics, just like estrogen did in the ovaries, and that's puberty. So the deepening of the voice, the increased musculature of men, the development of facial hair, chest hair, underarm hair, pubic hair, etc. So this question came from the NSC 2021 November exam. So I've cropped it a bit to keep it relevant. So during an emergency situation, gland E releases a hormone that prepares the body for fight or flight by stimulating an increase in breathing and heart rate, leads to increased energy production in the muscles and an increase in carbon dioxide levels. Name the hormone, adrenaline. Explain how an increase in breathing rate and heart rate increases the energy production in skeletal muscles. So that's an explain question. It's 4 marks. You've got to be very careful here. So make sure you almost are stating the obvious. So how does that increase in breathing rate result in increased energy production? That's one factor. And the increased heart rate. So more oxygen is inhaled and blood will be pumped faster. So that's covering breathing rate. That's covering heart rate. Now you think, okay, that's enough. But now you've got to say there that more blood will be transported to the skeletal muscles, and that blood contains oxygen and glucose, which will increase the rate of cellular respiration, because you've got to link energy production to the increased breathing and heart rate. So there's more oxygen, blood is moving quicker with more oxygen and glucose, which increases the rate of cellular respiration. Then, how is part B involved in the carbon dioxide homeostasis? That's the medulla oblongata. So there again, you had to just say the medulla is stimulated to send impulses to the heart and breathing muscles. So more blood is transported to the lungs, CO2 is exhaled faster, and it returns to normal. Whenever you're dealing with homeostasis, you end with that returns to normal point.